More Kansans are moving out of the state than in. What can we do to convince folks to stick around? And DCF fights back against accusations of mishandling cases, even as the governor-elect names a new department head tasked with cleaning up the system. Plus, what does a federal government shutdown mean to you? Some lawmakers think it could be a good thing for Kansas. That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week. I'm Pilar Pedraza, and this is Kansas Week. We'll get to all those stories in a bit, but first, a long-awaited announcement Friday morning from Senator Pat Roberts. He will be retiring. Senator Pat Roberts announced his coming retirement from Manhattan Friday. He says he will finish his current term and will continue to chair the Senate Ag Committee. He mentioned several of his accomplishments, including getting a record number of votes in favor of his latest bipartisan farm bill.
I have had the honor and privilege of representing Kansas for 16 years in the House, 22 years so far in the Senate. Never in my wildest dreams did I think I would become the longest-serving member of Congress in our state's history.
Roberts has represented Kansas in Washington since 1981, first in the House of Representatives, where he spent 16 years representing the big 1st District. Then elected to the Senate in 1996, where he's currently serving his 4th term, making him the longest-serving member of Congress in our state's history. And replacing Senator Roberts will not be an easy task. Here to help us break down this and other topics today, I'm joined by Senator Ed Berger, Kansas State Senator.
Kansas State Senator, correct.
Republican from Hutchinson. Dr. Neil Allen, political scientist from Wichita State University, and Representative Casey O'Hibelson, Democrat from Wichita. Thank you all so much for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
All right, Neil, I'm going to start with you. We've been hearing about the possibility of Senator Roberts retiring for some time now. Certainly since that 2014 election that, well, okay, he won handily, was not as big of a win as he was used to. What can we take away from today's announcement? What are the big takeaways from that?
Well, first, while usually an incumbent senator is a stronger candidate than someone in an open seat, the Republican Party probably is happy to have a different candidate. Although recent politics have shown that you can get all kinds of crazy candidates that could cause problems for parties. And if Roberts hadn't beat Milton Wolfe 4 years ago, then the Democrat likely would have won that seat. But also, Senator Roberts just had a huge victory on the Farm Bill that he's got 2 more years to continue to be part of the solution in Washington instead of part of the problem. And also, when you think about it, I mean, Pat Roberts is in some ways, a Republican of the past in the sense that he works with Democrats. He's strongly partisan, but is willing to make deals, much like his mentor, Bob Dole. And whoever replaces him will have a hard time fulfilling that legacy.
And talking about his history and his legacy and trying to replace him, we've heard a lot of names thrown out there so far, from Chris Kobach to Mike Pompeo. What are you seeing as probably the strongest contenders at this point?
Well, Pompeo is very strong and has been gunning for the seat for quite a while, but the question is whether he'd be willing to leave a much more powerful post right now for a Senate seat. Roger Marshall strikes me as the candidate that's most likely to run and possibly to win. His district includes only a quarter of the state's voters, but probably something like 40% or more of the state's Republicans. And also, one thing to keep in mind is that the Republican primary in September of 20 is going to occur after the Democratic and Republican presidential caucuses. And there's going to be a whole bunch of moderate Republicans that re-register as Democrats to vote in the Democratic primary or caucus here. And so the Republican primary electorate is going to get more and more conservative over time. And so it's going to be a real hard primary for a moderate.
Well, we'll have to wait and see. And certainly we've seen that Democrats, as the state has gotten more conservative in general, Democrats are having more success at this state level. So that might come into play in 2020. We'll have to wait and see. One of the things that Senator Roberts still will have to deal with, the federal government shutdown. It's entering week 3 now with no end in sight. Well, it means hundreds of thousands of Americans working with no guarantee of a paycheck. For now, at least. One Kansas congressman says the shutdown could be a good thing for Kansas. I found this story with Cake News.
If all of this can lead to a comprehensive, fair immigration reform, that could greatly impact Kansas' economy.
Kansas representative from the 1st District, Republican Roger Marshall, says while he's pushing hard to bring the ongoing federal shutdown to an end, that's not his only goal.
But I just feel like the job's not finished yet. If I stayed around until the Christmas Eve, it was a ghost town. Got back late last night, it's still kind of a ghost town.
Right now, about 800,000 federal workers across the country are either working with no guarantee of a paycheck, like these folks at the Wichita National Weather Service office, or sitting at home. The president has sworn not to sign a bill funding that last quarter of federal services until he gets the $5 billion he wants for a border wall. Marshall says getting the government fully functional again is important.
So I'm trying to put pressure on them to get the job done.
For him, that also means comprehensive immigration reform.
We have to be able to fund the government. We also need to find a solution for border security as well.
He says that's what most Kansans want.
In the surveys we've done, 80% of Kansans want us to figure out border security and immigration.
Because they need it to boost the state's ag-based economy.
For me to figure out immigration to solve the agriculture guest worker visa problem we have, I need border security first. So this is a stepping stone towards a bigger process as well. I think that's how Kansas will be most impacted.
And we've talked before on this show about how Western Kansas and trying to revitalize Western Kansas is a big deal. Certainly, we've seen some of these issues coming up at the State House level as well. How much of a fight is it in Kansas over dealing with immigration issues?
Well, I think immigration issues are significant for the state of Kansas, certainly, and the legal route, of course, is what's preferred, but there is a significant migrant worker population in Western Kansas. That's a very important part of the workforce. And certainly, if we can do something to facilitate the legal immigration of people from the South into the state, that's certainly something we should do. I think that one of the things that is really being pushed is to strengthen our ports of entry, make sure our ports of entry are strong and have all of the drug detection equipment that is necessary to make sure that person coming in isn't transporting illegal drugs. Certainly that's something that is a part of this effort. I think the wall has become somewhat symbolic. It's something that President Trump campaigned on, and now I think what you're looking at is maybe a different interpretation of what a wall is. Talking now about perhaps a steel wall or a slatted wall or something like that, and at one time it's just been a concrete wall. So that's a little bit of a shift in his position from what he had been previously. So hopefully we can get resolution on that soon, and we can open the government back up. I think that is holding government employees as hostage for something they really weren't a part of and aren't a part of is unconscionable.
Yeah. And certainly as we're talking about that, I've been speaking with folks who say they have noticed impacts. Somebody who had their wallet stolen and couldn't get a Social Security card replaced. Somebody else who gets HUD assistance for renters for their rent and has been told don't expect that for January, and she's going, I don't know how to pay my rent. I can't come up with this money. I'm a medical patient.
Well, most recently, in fact, just I think today in a discussion with leadership, legislative leadership, he indicated that the shutdown could go on for months and even years. So those are the kinds of things that are out there, and again, that I think that might be a hollow threat, but it's still something that if you're a federal employee, really, I'm sure is sombering.
Yeah. And Casey, have you been hearing anything from constituents at all?
Well, a lot of my constituents are not happy with the government shutdown. Of course, a lot of people who are employed by the federal government that are not working, of course, are now home. They're not able to earn an income. It's kind of very, very disappointing that we've gotten to this level whereby you have two sides, both the on the federal level. You know, you have the U.S. Congress and the president still kind of far apart as to what needs to be done to get the government open. But a resolution needs to be done quickly, you know, because a lot of people are working that, well, needs to get back to work, you know, to support their family. So that's a lot of things I've been hearing from my constituents.
Okay, so certainly Kansans are concerned about this. It's not the only thing they're thinking about. Voting rights, another big deal here in Kansas. A lawsuit over them in Dodge City has cost the Ford County about $70,000 so far, and defense attorneys are asking the court to help them save a little bit of money. The American Civil Liberties Union sued Ford County elections clerk Debbie Cox last October after she moved Dodge City's only polling site outside of the city. Now, Cox is asking the court, through her lawyers, to dismiss the case entirely, saying the election is over, nothing went wrong, and she'll have at least 2 polling sites from now on. Citing the mounting legal bills, Cox's attorneys also asked the court to put a hold on all other hearings in the case until the judge rules on the dismissal. The Topeka Capital-Journal reports a document it received through an open records request shows the county paid Cox's defense team $71,481 in October and November. And this is a case that kind of went international in the attention that it got. As we look at this, and the ACLU has stated very boldly, we intend to continue moving forward with this lawsuit. The experiences that you guys have had, do you see this something as a lawsuit that has any legs, or is it pretty much done with? Casey, I'll start with you.
Well, in respect to the lawsuit, I mean, of course, what happened in regards to the last election, nobody was quite happy in terms of actually moving the voting location outside. But of course, you know, what I can say is that there needs to be better done next time in terms of having voting access throughout Dodge City. You know, have people have access better, you know, in terms of location. So I think that I think we probably on the state level need to pass some kind of law that will actually say for locations to be easily accessible within a certain distance. So that's how I actually will see in regards to going with this lawsuit.
Interesting.
But you know, when you think about this though, you know, the shows in Dodge City and also in terms of the state in general, that it costs the state and the taxpayers money when we have election officials that are not committed to opening the polls to as many people as possible, because we do have laws that back that up. Now, those laws aren't as strong as they used to be because the Supreme Court has gutted the Voting Rights Act. But Chris Kobach's time as Secretary of State cost the state, you know, tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees, and also lots of time from our state workers. And it didn't, well, I suppose it did yield some dozen or so cases, but it's great now that we have the Secretary of State who seems to be committed, even though he's a Republican, to wide access to the polls.
You know, I think something that's very important is just what we've been discussing, is how you can create as many opportunities as possible for an electorate to have access to a polling place. You know, early voting, and again, it's a local issue, I'm sure, but in our county, we have multiple sites for early voting. They can go to the college, they can go to a Wesley Towers retirement facility, that, you know, all over the community, so they have access and opportunity to vote. And even with that, you know, the turnout isn't stellar. So by all means, every barrier to voting should be removed that possibly can be, so we have a right to participate in the process. That's one of our, that's what we're all about in this country, that's democracy.
Well, certainly probably something it sounds like we might be hearing about in the state legislature this next session.
Could be.
Okay, moving on. Kansas Governor-elect Laura Kelly has made no secret of the fact she thinks the Department of Children and Families needs an overhaul. Now the DCF is fighting back against some of her charges. A KU study correlating emergency welfare aid restrictions with an increase in children in foster care was sloppy, slanted, and incomplete. That's the determination of a private research team DCF hired to reevaluate the study. The head of that team, University of Maryland professor Douglas Besheroff, once worked for a conservative think tank and heads the school's welfare reform program, according to the Kansas News Service. Among other things, the study concludes other states with equally high caseload declines do not show the same strong inverse correlation between declining TANF caseloads and rising child maltreatment and foster care placements. Governor-elect Laura Kelly has repeatedly referenced the KU study in her calls for reform of DCF and welfare in Kansas. The same day DCF released this reevaluation, Kelly announced her interim choice to head DCF and the Kansas Department for Aging and Disability Services, social services veteran Laura Howard, who's worked at both the state and federal levels. And I know that reforming the child welfare system and certainly DCF has been a big thing that the legislature bipartisanly has been working on for a couple of years now. The Child Welfare Task Force just wrapping up its report last month. As we look at that, how much impact do you think this now disputed study from KU will have on what happens next session, Ed?
I think it have significant impact, but I think what's more important is there have been about 3 post audits done on DCF, and those post audits need to be revisited and look at solutions for those, because those post audits are pretty harsh, and going back to them and seeing what kind of solution can be resolved to those post audits. That's a starting point. I think that Secretary Meyer Hummel had a good start, and she probably was implementing some of the changes that needed to take place. Was it perhaps as done as quickly as it should have been, or in the same manner that the governor-elect wants to have happen? Maybe not. But that is the governor-elect's prerogative to choose her secretaries, and she evidently sees that change as being something important to moving the DCF forward.
Casey?
Well, in regards to the study, I mean, of course, it's always been known that the DCF has always been lacking funds in terms of doing their work. Of course, the last head of the department, Gina, she came in, she was there for like less than a year, but she really did good work in terms of filling in vacancies that were open, training, and also promoting child safety as well. But this new person that the governor-elect has appointed, she's bringing in someone who has a lot more experience. I think is going to be a positive, for the department and also for the state as well.
Okay, I've got, Neil, a specific question for you. One thing I found interesting when the governor-elect announced Laura Howard's appointment to DCF, she was also going to be the interim head of KDADS, the Department of Aging and Disability. Now, those used to be part of the same overall Department of Social Services in Kansas. Is this perhaps a sign of things going backward?
Well, I would think it might more be a sign that Laura Kelly is signaling that she is going to use executive resources to try to impact public policy in Kansas. And that makes sense for her because while the legislature has Democrats in it and moderate Republicans who are going to be friendly to Kelly, that she doesn't have strong support among the leadership in either house. And so I see this as a signal by Kelly that she's willing to revisit all kinds of executive organizations, and she's going to use her appointment power to try to move public policy in a direction that's very different than what it was under the Brownback administration.
All right, we'll have to wait and see what happens there. Sorry, we got to move on.
Mm.
We're running out of time. I told you this would happen. Another story that's bringing Wichita international headlines this week, the case of a man arrested for attacking a 1-year-old boy, knocking him over and yelling racial slurs at him. KSN News' Jasmine Haynes spoke with the boy's mother shortly after the attack.
He's really sweet and he's friendly. I just don't know why someone would want to attack him.
Attack LaShante Whitaker's 1-year-old son, Javi, from behind.
We were going into the grocery store. My daughter, she's 11. She was walking my son holding his hand, and they were behind me, and I was getting a cart, and we were on our way into the store.
Walking into the Dillons near East Douglas Avenue and North Hillside Street Sunday morning around 6:30.
I heard a thud, like a loud thud, and I'm thinking it's something that fell off a shelf or something, but my daughter started to scream, so I turned around, and she was picking my son off the ground, and he was screaming to the top of his lungs.
Police say the man who kicked her son was attempting to flee the scene, but a man who witnessed the incident stepped in.
He had tackled him to the ground and held him there. Then the other associates from Dillons came and helped hold him on the ground until the police came.
31-year-old Riff Trace was arrested for kicking Whitaker's toddler son in the back while yelling racial slurs.
He was just referring to us as the N-word and just making it known that he was a white supremacist and just repeatedly saying it over and over.
Trace was booked for battery that was biased and racially motivated and resisting arrest. Whitaker says she's still in shock.
You know, what person sitting around at the Dillons waiting to attack, children, hoping that they give them time and it doesn't happen again to somebody else's child.
Now, of course, since then, a number of other issues have come out, including the background and the drug and homeless history of the alleged attacker in this case. But one thing I think that struck me the most was I had a number of friends within the African American, within the Hispanic communities who told me this brought back so many different incidents that had happened in their lives over the years. Just little things that maybe we might not think about, but over time kind of build up, referred to as microaggressions in some circles. And I don't want to be stereotypical, but Casey, I'm going to go to you on this one. As we talk about these issues, as cases like this come up, how does that impact our minority communities, the communities that you represent?
Wow. Well, in regards to the incident that happened, of course, it was a very terrible situation that happened. Of course, it was a season of Christmas whereby people should be coming together. And of course, what happened at the store was, very, very disappointing. This actually brings the awareness of us, on the state level, putting more emphasis on mental health. Of course, people that need help can find ways to get it. As a community, of course, we're actually devastated as to what happened, but but at some point, we just have to come together, and just acknowledge what's out there and have to deal with it. So people who have called me have said that they would like to see more in terms of outreach, in terms of community relations. So I think that's the best way I can be able to put it as to what needs to be done at this time.
All right, well, we're going to have to leave that there. Wichita police blame stolen guns and drugs for the high number of killings in the city last year, the most in decades. It's a crime trend police want stopped, and they say state lawmakers can help. This is a story I filed with Cake News.
Well, research helps, right? Everybody's got an opinion on this polarizing issue.
Chief Gordon Ramsey says he's done more than watch over the last few years as gun crime has climbed in Wichita.
We are actively using technology. We introduced ShotSpotter, where we're detecting shots through the use of technology so we can respond quicker and be more effective.
Assigning more officers to violent crime investigations and working on prevention programs throughout the city.
And so we are doing everything we can on our end, but really this is a community issue, right? We need to
and
make sure
one
that
part of that community, Kansas lawmakers, he says, could put a big dent in the problem his department faces.
One of the things I would like to see is I would love to see gang members that meet the criteria, fit the definition of a gang member. They should not be allowed to carry a firearm.
Ramsey would also like to see lawmakers stiffen penalties for felons who are caught with guns they're not legally allowed to have.
I would like to see an increased penalty with mandatory minimums.
He'd also like to see increased treatment for those with drug problems and mental illnesses.
And the majority of our property crimes are drug related, right? So people get upset at the police, and as we try and find resources for those suffering from addiction, should it be over at the jail, or can we get them help and end this problem once and for all?
And one of the big questions I had on that is, of course, Chief Ramsey has a whole list of things he would love to see lawmakers do, but you guys have a pretty full plate this session. Chances of major law enforcement reform happening, Casey? Yes, no, maybe?
Yeah, I'll probably say maybe on that.
Ed?
I think it's, again, there's a lot on our plate, and that's probably not going to be something that's going to be a giant priority for us as we move forward. But I think the mental illness issue is something that we really have to address, and indirectly that addresses some of the things the Chief was talking about. Our county jails have mentally ill in them, and they aren't equipped to handle them, and that's a real problem.
And that was one of the other big things. It wasn't in that story, but a different one I did with him out of that interview that you talked about was the mental illness aspect. So, yeah, and we've certainly had conversations here before about the lack of mental illness help available in this state. We've got one other thing to talk about. We haven't left the state, but apparently a lot of people are. For the 5th straight year, more people have moved out of Kansas than moved in. That's according to one study by United Van Lines, a moving company. KSN News' Jana Sebas takes a look at what it is that keeps those who stay in Kansas.
First things that come to my mind are agriculture and basketball.
Cassidy Blue is a true Kansan. This porch on her rocking chair with a couple of dogs is where she likes to be.
Family-wise, I feel like this is a great state to even raise your kids in.
Kansas could also be a great place to start a business.
This is the third location. The two subsequent locations have grown exponentially.
There's an old saying, home is where the heart is.
I wouldn't be anywhere else but here.
But is this state keeping people home or driving people out? An annual study puts Kansas as the number 5 state people are leaving the most.
That's never a good statistic to hear. You always want people to stick around.
It didn't surprise me, but it was sad and disappointing.
The study done by moving company United Van Line says more than 58% of its moving trips in Kansas are outbound.
And maybe some people have moved out for one reason or another.
I mean, we don't have a beach really, so I can kind of see that if they're more of a beach person.
Beach or not, some people are questioning if the study is giving the state a fair shake.
It's hard to say.
Hard to understand, if that makes sense.
No.
You know, whether or not these sources are credible.
I just don't think it's quite as accurate.
I've seen in the time that I've been here, Kansas growing.
All right, another study actually suggests that Kansas is growing. According to World Population Review, Kansas has a 0.57% growth rate, which ranks 31st in the country. John Acebis, KSN News 3.
Of course, that difference could have partially be explained by birth rate. I have to put that out there. But as we look at this from a policy perspective, from a political perspective, this is not something that just Kansas deals with. A lot of states are dealing with the issue of how to keep people in state. That's an ongoing fight, Neil.
Well, that's right. And also the big growth in jobs in America in the last 10, 20 years has been in big metro areas that have lots of tech employment and lots of knowledge work. And we don't have a whole lot of that in Kansas, a bit in Kansas City. And we're certainly trying to get that going here in Wichita at my employer, Wichita State University. But, you know, the states that do well are states that invest in human capital. And with the Kansas budget crisis of 2013 and forward, it's been hard for us to do that, and it's shown in our population numbers.
All right. Well, we'll have to wait and see what happens. I know the legislature with the Rural Revitalization Committee and some other things looking at trying to change that. We'll have to see if anything happens. Ed, Neil, Casey, thank you guys so much for joining me. We've run out of time, as we always do. I appreciate our discussion, and I hope that you as well have enjoyed it. We would love to continue the talk online. Just look for Pilar Pedraza TV on Facebook or Twitter. For now, have a great week.